The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of jets on the tarmac. Captain Marcus, Reaper, Hendricks scanned the assembled pilots with the kind of calculating stare that had earned him his reputation in 3 tours with DEVGRU. His question hung in the air like smoke from a downed aircraft. Any combat pilots here? The room was packed with aviators from every branch, their flight suits bearing patches from elite squadrons, their faces carrying the weathered confidence of men who danced with death at 30,000 feet. Yet nobody moved. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, then awkward, then almost painful. In the back corner, near the coffee station with its perpetually burnt brew, Lieutenant Commander Zara Ghost Akafer remained perfectly still. Her olive-drab flight suit was unremarkable except for the faded navy wings above her left breast pocket and a small patch most wouldn't recognize, the distinctive skull and crossed daggers of a unit that officially didn't exist. Her dark skin showed no reaction to Hendricks' challenge, but her fingers, wrapped around a ceramic mug, tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd been through this dance before, in briefing rooms from Kandahar to the South China Sea. The presumption, the overlooking, the moment when someone finally noticed she was there at all. Hendricks' eyes swept past her twice before something made him pause and look back. Maybe it was the way she held herself, not the studied casualness of pilots trying to appear unimpressed, but the genuine stillness of someone who had nothing to prove because she'd already proven everything that mattered. Maybe it was the call sign Ghost, barely visible on her name tape, or the fact that while every other aviator in the room was either staring at him or studying their boots, she was watching the tactical display at the front of the room with the kind of focus reserved for threat assessment. The briefing room held maybe 60 pilots from Air Force, Navy, Marines, and Army aviation units. Fighter jocks, transport pilots, helicopter crews, drone operators, a cross-section of American military aviation assembled for what the classified orders called Operation Nightfall. The mission parameters were still sealed, but rumors had been circulating for weeks. Something big. Something that required the kind of precision and lethality that only came from pilots who'd been tested under fire, who'd felt the weight of life and death decisions measured in milliseconds and miles per hour. Slowly, deliberately, Zara set down her coffee mug and rose to her feet. The movement was fluid, economical, like everything else about her. No wasted motion, no theatrics, just a pilot acknowledging a question that finally applied to her. The silence in the room shifted, becoming electric, charged with possibility and sudden attention. Every head turned toward the back corner where this unremarkable woman stood waiting, her expression neutral, her posture relaxed, her presence suddenly filling a space that had seemed empty moments before. The morning sun streaming through the briefing room windows caught the edges of her wings, making them gleam like polished steel. Outside, F-35s taxied toward their holding positions, their engines creating a symphony of controlled violence that every person in that room understood in their bones. But inside, in that moment of crystalline silence, there was only the weight of recognition dawning on 60 faces, and the quiet confidence of a pilot who'd been waiting her entire career for someone to ask the right question. Captain Hendricks' expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his tactical mind already recalculating. In the special operations community, reputations were built on whispered stories and classified after-action reports. Ghost wasn't a call sign you earned flying milk runs or training exercises. It was something earned in places where maps had blank spaces and missions that never officially happened. The kind of call sign that made seasoned operators pause and reassess, that made them wonder what shadows this woman had flown through, and what targets had disappeared into smoke and silence under her watch. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence answered every question Hendricks hadn't known he was asking. The briefing room, filled with some of the most accomplished aviators in the American military, waited to see what would happen next. Outside, the Jets continued their endless cycle of preparation and readiness, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. A puzzle piece had been revealed, and suddenly the shape of Operation Nightfall was beginning to make sense in ways that classified briefings and tactical assessments could never quite capture. The morning light continued to stream through those windows, painting shadows across faces that had seen combat from the cockpits of the world's most advanced aircraft. But all attention was focused on the woman in the back corner, who just answered a question that nobody else in the room had been brave enough to claim. Zara Ghost Akaffer stood in that charged silence, surrounded by the weight of assumption and the power of revelation, while somewhere in the distance, another flight of jets lifted off into the endless blue sky that had been her home, her battlefield, and her sanctuary for the better part of a decade. The game was about to change, and she was exactly where she needed to be. Hendricks cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. "Combat pilots," he repeated, his voice carrying a different weight now, a different recognition. Around the room, subtle shifts in posture and expression revealed the collective recalibration happening in real time. This wasn't just another briefing. This wasn't just another mission. This was the moment when legends began, when stories were born that would be whispered in ready rooms and squadron bars for years to come. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the jets rumbled in the distance, and in the space between silence and speech, between question and answer, the future of Operation Nightfall crystallized around a pilot whose reputation had been carved from classified missions and unspoken victories. Ghost had stepped forward, and the shadows of the Special Operations world were about to discover what that meant. "Good," Hendricks said finally, his voice carrying approval that meant more than medals or commendations. "We're going to need you." The words hit the room like ordnance, precise and devastating in their simplicity. Every pilot present understood that they just witnessed something significant, a moment when the hidden machinery of special operations warfare revealed one of its most carefully guarded secrets. In the back corner of that briefing room, surrounded by the best aviators America had to offer, Lieutenant Commander Zara Ghost Akaffer had just become the center of gravity around which everything else would orbit. The mission brief began in earnest then, with tactical displays lighting up and classified folders being distributed under the watchful eyes of armed security personnel. But the real briefing had already happened in that moment of silence, in that simple question, and that deceptively quiet answer. Combat experience wasn't just about flight hours or medals or the stories you could tell at the bar. It was about the stories you couldn't tell, the missions that never happened, the targets that simply vanished into the night without explanation or acknowledgement. Ghost resumed her seat, her coffee growing cold, her attention focused on the evolving tactical situation, displayed on screens that showed satellite imagery of a region that officially didn't exist on any map. Around her, the assembled pilots began to understand that they were part of something larger than a routine special operations mission. They were part of the moment when America's hidden war capabilities stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh light of necessity. The briefing room windows showed a perfect blue sky streaked with contrails, the eternal canvas where aviators wrote their stories in vapor and violence. But inside, under those humming lights, surrounded by the cream of military aviation, Ghost was already thinking 3 moves ahead, already calculating angles of attack and extraction routes, already transforming from observer to participant in whatever classified hell was about to unfold. The question had been asked. The answer had been given. Now came the part where reputations were either forged or shattered against the unforgiving reality of combat operations, where failure meant more than just a poor performance review. Hendricks studied his newly assembled team with the calculating gaze of a man who'd orchestrated more classified operations than most people would ever know existed. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still partially obscured by the shadows of operational security and the fog of war that hadn't even begun yet. What he did know was that Ghost's simple act of standing up had changed the entire dynamic of Operation Nightfall, had shifted it from routine special operations to something that felt like destiny. The morning sun climbed higher outside those briefing room windows, and somewhere in the distance, more jets took to the sky, their pilots unaware that history was being written in classified folders and whispered conversations. The war was coming, had been coming for months, and finally the pieces were in position. The question had been asked, the answer given, and now Lieutenant Commander Zara Ghost Akaffer was about to discover that some reputations, once revealed, could never be hidden again. The silence had fallen, but the storm was just beginning. In that briefing room filled with America's finest aviators, under fluorescent lights that revealed everything and nothing, the foundations of legend were being laid, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the quiet professionalism of warriors who understood that the most important battles were often fought in rooms like this, where decisions were made that would echo through history books that would never be written. Ghost had answered the question. Now came the test of whether she could live up to the answer. The tactical displays continued their silent rotation, showing terrain and targets that would soon become intimate familiar to every person in that room. But the real geography being mapped was the space between reputation and reality, between assumption and acknowledgement, between the pilot everyone thought they saw and the warrior who just stepped forward to claim her place in an operation that would define the next chapter of America's hidden wars. Outside, the endless sky waited, patient and impartial, ready to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. Inside, under those humming lights, surrounded by the quiet confidence of military aviation's elite, Ghost prepared for the moment when all the classified missions and unspoken victories would finally be put to the ultimate test. The question had been simple. The answer would be written in smoke and fire across a sky that had seen too many good pilots fall. But for now, in this moment of crystalline possibility, anything was possible and everything was at stake. Captain Hendricks looked at his assembled team and saw potential. Zara Ghost Akaffer looked at the same tactical displays and saw something else entirely. The geometry of violence, the calculus of survival, and the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the pilot everyone was counting on when counting was all that mattered. The briefing continued, but the real conversation was happening in glances and subtle nods, in the unspoken language of warriors who recognized each other across the artificial boundaries of rank and service branch. The room filled with the rustle of classified papers and the soft glow of tactical displays, but the electricity in the air came from something else entirely, the recognition that they were part of something that would be remembered, something that would matter, something that would test every assumption about what was possible when the best of the best were finally given a mission worthy of their skills. Ghost had stepped forward. The silence had fallen. And now, in this room where legends were born, the real work was about to begin. The classified briefing folders were distributed with the precision of a military operation, each packet containing information that could reshape global politics if it ever saw daylight. But the most important intelligence in the room couldn't be classified or contained. It was the dawning understanding that Operation Nightfall had just acquired its center of gravity, its focal point, its ghost in the machine who would either make the mission legendary or ensure it became another cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of the special operations community. Hendricks opened his folder and began to speak, his words carrying the weight of classified authority and operational necessity. But his eyes kept drifting to the back corner where Ghost sat with her cooling coffee and her quiet confidence, where the woman who'd answered his question was already 3 steps ahead of whatever he was about to reveal. The morning sun continued its climb toward noon. The jets continued their endless dance of readiness. And in a briefing room where silence had fallen like snow, the next chapter of warfare was about to be written by a pilot whose reputation was carved from shadows and classified victories. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, The tactical displays painted their electronic pictures of terrain and targets, and somewhere in the space between question and answer, between reputation and reality, Lieutenant Commander Zara Ghost Akaffer prepared for the mission that would either validate everything she'd become or destroy everything she'd built. The silence had fallen. The storm was coming, and Ghost was exactly where she needed to be. Ghost's tactical mind was already processing the implications even as Hendricks spoke. The satellite imagery on the screens showed a region she recognized from her classified past: mountainous terrain, limited landing zones, weather patterns that could turn lethal without warning. The kind of operational environment where margins for error didn't exist and pilot skill was measured in heartbeats and altitude changes. She'd flown missions in similar terrain, through similar conditions, against similar targets. The difference was that those missions had never officially happened, had never appeared in after-action reports or performance evaluations. Now, surrounded by pilots who'd built their reputations on acknowledged victories and public commendations, she was being asked to bring those shadow skills into the light. The irony wasn't lost on her. A career spent being invisible was about to become very visible indeed. Around the room, she could feel the subtle shift in attention, the recalibration happening as her fellow aviators tried to reconcile the quiet woman in the back corner with the implications of her presence at this particular briefing. The morning was becoming afternoon. The briefing was entering its crucial phase, and somewhere in the distance, more jets were taking off into that endless blue sky that had been home to so many classified missions, so many unacknowledged victories, so many moments when the difference between success and catastrophe had come down to the skills of a pilot whose name would never appear in the history books. But names, Ghost had learned long ago, were just words. What mattered was the work, the mission, the moment when everything depended on the person behind the stick. Hendricks continued his briefing, but the real communication was happening in the spaces between words, in the glances and subtle nods that passed between operators who understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. Outside, the sky waited with infinite patience, ready to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. Inside, under those humming fluorescent lights, Ghost prepared for the moment when her classified past would finally meet her unclassified future, when the shadows would give way to the harsh light of operational necessity. The question had been asked, the silence had fallen, and now, as the briefing moved toward its climax and the true nature of Operation Nightfall began to emerge, Lieutenant Commander Zara Ghost Akaffer found herself exactly where she'd always been, at the center of the storm, invisible until the moment when being invisible was no longer an option. The reputation she'd built in the shadows was about to be tested in the harsh light of reality, and everyone in that room was about to discover what it meant when a ghost stepped out of the darkness and into the fire. The tactical displays continued their rotation, painting pictures of terrain that would soon become intimate familiar to every pilot in that room. But the most important terrain being mapped was the distance between assumption and reality, between reputation and performance, between the quiet confidence of a pilot who'd answered a simple question and the operational demands of a mission that would test every skill she'd acquired in the classified corners of America's hidden wars. Ghost sat in her chair, surrounded by the finest aviators her country could produce, and prepared for the moment when all her carefully guarded secrets would finally be put to the ultimate test. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly blue, marked only by the contrails of jets whose pilots had no idea that history was being written in a briefing room where silence had fallen like snow and legends were being born in the space between question and answer. The morning sun climbed higher, the mission parameters became clearer, and in that room where America's aviation elite gathered to plan Operation Nightfall, Ghost prepared for the flight that would either validate everything she'd become or destroy everything she'd built. The question had been simple. The answer would be written in fire and smoke across a sky that had witnessed too many good pilots fall, but had never seen anything quite like what was about to unfold. The briefing reached its critical phase as Hendricks activated the main tactical display, revealing satellite imagery that made several pilots unconsciously lean forward in their chairs. The target area was a maze of valleys and ridgelines in a region where three hostile nations converged, where surface-to-air missile installations dotted the landscape like deadly flowers, and where weather patterns could shift from clear skies to instrument-only conditions in minutes. It was the kind of operational environment that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones, where split-second decisions carried consequences measured in lives and geopolitical implications. Ghost studied the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who'd navigated similar challenges in places that didn't appear on official maps. Her mind was already calculating approach vectors, identifying potential extraction points, and assessing the 1,000 variables that would determine mission success or catastrophic failure. Around her, she could hear the subtle sounds of professional aviators processing the same information, sharp intakes of breath, the rustle of flight suits as bodies unconsciously tensed, the soft whisper of pens making notes on classified briefing materials. "The target," Hendricks continued, his voice carrying the weight of operational necessity, "is a hardened facility built into the mountainside approximately here." A red dot appeared on the display, marking a location that seemed impossible to reach by conventional means. Intelligence indicates the facility houses technology that cannot be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The mission window is 48 hours. Weather conditions during that window will be marginal at best. He paused, letting the implications sink in. This is not a routine operation. This is not a training exercise. This is the kind of mission that gets written about in books that are never published. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different from the one that had greeted his initial question. This was the silence of professionals calculating odds, assessing risks, and mentally preparing for the kind of mission that would either make careers or end them. Ghost felt the familiar calm that settled over her before difficult operations, the mental shift from everyday awareness to combat consciousness that had kept her alive through missions that officially never happened. Her eyes traced the satellite imagery, noting details that others might miss, the shadow patterns that indicated hidden installations, the vegetation changes that suggested underground facilities, the seemingly random road patterns that actually formed a sophisticated defensive network. This wasn't just a target. It was a fortress built by people who understood that their survival depended on making it impossible for conventional forces to reach them. The kind of place that required unconventional approaches and pilots willing to push beyond the safe margins of standard operating procedures. The primary challenge, Hendricks continued, is access. Conventional approach routes are covered by overlapping air defense systems. Satellite surveillance indicates at least 12 SA-300 missile sites, with additional mobile units operating in the area. Electronic warfare capabilities are assumed to be state-of-the-art. Communications will be degraded or completely jammed once we enter the operational area. He clicked to the next slide, showing a three-dimensional rendering of the target area that made the tactical challenges even more apparent. The facility was nestled in a valley surrounded by peaks that rose over 12,000 feet, creating a natural barrier that limited approach options to a handful of corridors, each covered by multiple missile sites. Weather data showed cloud ceilings that rarely rose above 8,000 feet, with winds that could exceed 50 knots with little warning. It was the kind of environment where even experienced mountain pilots could find themselves in trouble, where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in meters and seconds. Ghost had flown in similar conditions, through similar defenses, against similar targets. The difference was that those missions had been solo operations, where her survival had depended only on her own skills and decision-making. This operation would require coordination with other aircraft, adherence to timeline constraints, and the kind of precision that could only be achieved when every pilot involved was operating at the absolute peak of their capabilities. The stakes were higher, the variables more complex, and the consequences of failure would extend far beyond personal survival. Around the room, she could sense the subtle shifts in body language that indicated professional aviators coming to terms with the reality of what they were being asked to do. This wasn't a routine strike mission or a standard special operations insertion. This was the kind of operation that required pilots to fly beyond their normal comfort zones, to push aircraft to their performance limits, and to make split-second decisions in conditions where standard procedures might not apply. The kind of mission that created legends or cautionary tales, with very little middle ground between the two outcomes. Hendricks clicked to the next slide, revealing aircraft assignments and mission roles. Each pilot has been selected based on specific capabilities and experience profiles. This is not a volunteer mission. This is a directed operation based on assessed ability to contribute to mission success. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Ghost before continuing. Flight leads will be announced shortly. Mission commanders have been designated based on tactical experience and operational background. The tension in the room was palpable now, the kind of electric anticipation that preceded high-stakes operations where reputations would be made or destroyed. Ghost felt the familiar pre-mission focus settling over her, the mental state that had kept her alive through operations in places where mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they were fatal. She'd been here before, in different rooms with different faces, but always the same underlying reality. Exceptional pilots being asked to do exceptional things in conditions where exceptional was the minimum standard for survival. The satellite imagery continued its slow rotation on the tactical displays, showing a target that seemed designed to test every skill a combat pilot could possess. High-altitude operations, electronic warfare environments, defended airspace, marginal weather conditions, and terrain that left no room for error. It was the kind of mission profile that would normally require months of specialized training and preparation. Instead, they were being given 48 hours to plan, brief, and execute an operation that would either demonstrate the superiority of American aviation capabilities or provide a very expensive lesson in the limits of even the most skilled pilots. Ghost's mind was already working through the tactical challenges, identifying the key decision points where success or failure would be determined. The approach to the target area would require flying through defended airspace while maintaining formation integrity. The actual strike phase would demand precision navigation in mountainous terrain with limited visibility. The extraction would need to be executed under time pressure with potentially degraded aircraft systems and wounded crew members. Each phase presented challenges that would test different aspects of pilot skill and aircraft capability. But beyond the tactical considerations, she was processing the strategic implications of the mission. Facilities like the one shown in the satellite imagery weren't built randomly. They represented significant investments in technology and capability that hostile nations considered worth protecting at almost any cost. The fact that American special operations were willing to risk this level of exposure to eliminate the facility suggested that the stakes extended far beyond regional security concerns. This was the kind of target that could shift the balance of power in an entire region, the kind of mission that would be analyzed and studied by military historians for decades to come. The briefing continued with technical specifications and operational parameters, but Ghost was already thinking beyond the immediate mission requirements. Success would depend not just on individual pilot skill, but on the ability of the entire formation to function as a coordinated unit under extreme stress. Communication protocols would need to be established that could function in a degraded electronic environment. Contingency plans would need to account for aircraft losses, weather changes, and enemy responses that couldn't be fully anticipated. The kind of comprehensive planning that separated successful special operations from expensive disasters. Around her, the assembled pilots were coming to the same realizations. the growing understanding that Operation Nightfall would test every aspect of their training and experience. This wasn't just another mission. It was the mission that would define their careers, that would either validate years of training and preparation, or reveal the limits of what even the best pilots could accomplish when faced with impossible odds. The silence in the room had evolved from surprise to recognition to grim determination, the mental shift that occurred when professionals realized they were about to attempt something that existed at the very edge of what was possible. Ghost sat in her chair, surrounded by America's finest aviators, and felt the familiar calm that preceded difficult operations. The target was challenging, the conditions marginal, and the stakes higher than most missions she'd flown. But she'd answered Hendricks' question, had stepped forward when others hesitated, and now found herself exactly where she'd always been, at the center of operations that would either succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically, with no middle ground between victory and disaster. The briefing was reaching its climax, the mission parameters were becoming clear, and Lieutenant Commander Zara Ghost Akaffer was preparing for the flight that would either cement her legend or provide a very expensive lesson in the limits of even the most skilled pilots when faced with impossible odds. The morning had become afternoon, the briefing room had become a war room, and somewhere in the distance, more jets continued their endless cycle of preparation and readiness, their pilots unaware that the next chapter of aviation warfare was being written in classified folders and whispered conversations. The question had been asked, the answer given, and now Ghost was about to discover whether her reputation, built in the shadows of classified operations, could survive the harsh light of a mission that would test everything she'd learned in the hidden corners of America's longest wars. Hendricks paused in his briefing, his eyes scanning the room with the calculating gaze of an operator who'd orchestrated more classified missions than most people knew existed. The satellite imagery on the tactical displays showed a target that seemed designed by hostile architects to test every limit of American aviation capability. But more importantly, it showed the kind of operational challenge that separated routine special operations from the missions that became legend. Whispered about in pilot-ready rooms and special operations compounds for decades after the classified files were sealed, and the participants sworn to secrecy. "Mission assignments," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned his reputation in the most unforgiving operational environments. Primary strike element will consist of 4 aircraft. Support elements include electronic warfare, search and rescue, and combat air patrol. Each element has been configured based on assessed capability and mission requirements. He paused again, and Ghost could feel the attention in the room crystallizing around specific pilots, the subtle recognition that some names were about to be called that would carry more weight than others. The tactical display shifted to show aircraft configurations and mission roles, revealing the complex choreography that would be required to successfully penetrate defended airspace, eliminate the target, and extract without catastrophic losses. It was the kind of mission that looked elegant on paper, but would require split-second decision-making and flawless execution under conditions where standard operating procedures might not apply. The kind of operation that created legends or cautionary tales, with very little room for anything in between. Ghost felt the familiar pre-mission calm settling over her consciousness, the mental shift from everyday awareness to combat focus that had kept her alive through operations in places where survival depended on the ability to process multiple threats simultaneously, while maintaining aircraft control under extreme conditions. Around her, she could sense similar transformations occurring as professional aviators mentally prepared for the kind of mission that would either validate their training or expose the limits of what even exceptional pilots could accomplish when faced with seemingly impossible odds. The briefing room had become something more than a place where information was exchanged. It had become the crucible where reputations would be forged or shattered, where the theoretical skills developed in training environments would be tested against the unforgiving reality of combat operations in defended airspace. The satellite imagery continued its rotation, painting electronic pictures of terrain that would soon become intimately familiar to every pilot involved. Terrain where the difference between success and catastrophe would be measured in altitude changes and reaction times. But beneath the technical details and tactical considerations, Ghost was processing something else entirely. The recognition that Operation Nightfall represented more than just another special operations mission. It was the kind of operation that would either demonstrate the continued superiority of American aviation capabilities, or provide very expensive evidence that even the most advanced technology and highly trained personnel had limits that hostile nations were prepared to test. The stakes extended far beyond mission success or failure. They encompassed strategic implications that would resonate through military planning for years to come. Hendricks clicked to the next slide, revealing individual pilot assignments with the precision of someone who understood that success would depend not just on individual capability, but on the ability to create teams that could function under extreme stress in conditions where communication might be compromised, and decision-making would need to occur in milliseconds rather than minutes. The room fell silent as aviators processed their roles in an operation that would either make careers or end them, where performance would be measured against standards that left no room for anything less than exceptional execution. Ghost waited, her mind already working through the tactical implications of different possible assignments, while maintaining the calm focus that had become her trademark in operational environments. She'd been here before, in different rooms with different faces, but always the same underlying reality: exceptional pilots being asked to do exceptional things under conditions where exceptional was merely the starting point for survival. The difference was that previous missions had been conducted in the shadows, with results that would never appear in official records or performance evaluations. Now, surrounded by America's aviation elite in a briefing room where classified information was being shared with unprecedented transparency, she found herself in the unusual position of being visible rather than invisible, acknowledged rather than overlooked, recognized rather than forgotten. It was a transition that carried both opportunities and risks. The chance to finally receive credit for capabilities that had been developed in the classified corners of military aviation, balanced against the exposure that came with stepping out of the shadows and into the harsh light of operational accountability. The tactical displays showed a mission profile that would challenge every aspect of pilot training and aircraft capability. High-altitude operations in mountainous terrain, electronic warfare environments that would degrade navigation and communication systems, defended airspace protected by state-of-the-art missile installations, and weather conditions that could shift from marginal to impossible with little warning. The kind of operational environment where pilot skill would be measured not in hours of flight time or training scores, but in the ability to make correct decisions under extreme stress when the consequences of error extended far beyond personal survival. Around the room, professional aviators were coming to terms with the reality that Operation Nightfall would exist at the very edge of what was tactically possible, requiring performance levels that exceeded normal training standards and pushed both human and mechanical systems to their operational limits. It was the kind of mission that military historians would study for decades, analyzing decision points and tactical choices that would either demonstrate the effectiveness of advanced training and superior technology, or provide expensive lessons in the limits of what even exceptional personnel could accomplish when faced with carefully prepared defensive systems. Ghost felt the weight of professional responsibility settling over her like a familiar garment, the recognition that she was about to become part of something that would either validate years of classified operations and hidden achievements, or expose the gap between reputation and reality under conditions where failure carried consequences that extended far beyond individual career prospects. The briefing was approaching its climax. Assignments were about to be announced, and Lieutenant Commander Zara Ghost Akaffer was preparing for the moment when her carefully guarded reputation would finally be tested against the most demanding operational environment American military aviation could devise. The question had been asked, the silence had fallen, and now Ghost was about to discover whether the skills developed in missions that never officially happened could translate to success in an operation that would either become a classified legend or a very expensive cautionary tale about the limits of ambition when confronted with the unforgiving reality of modern air defense systems, operated by people who understood that their survival depended on making American aviation pay the highest possible price for every target eliminated and every objective achieved. Hendricks approached the moment of mission assignment with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether Operation Nightfall succeeded brilliantly or failed catastrophically. The satellite imagery on the tactical displays showed a target that represented the pinnacle of defensive engineering, a facility designed by hostile architects who had studied American aviation capabilities and constructed their fortress specifically to test every limit of pilot skill and aircraft performance. The kind of target that existed at the intersection of tactical challenge and strategic necessity, where success would demonstrate continued American air superiority and failure would provide expensive evidence that even advanced technology and exceptional training had limits. "Primary strike leader," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of classified authority and operational necessity, "will be Lieutenant Commander Akaffer." The words hit the briefing room like precision ordnance, creating a moment of crystalline silence as 60 of America's finest aviators processed the implications of what they'd just heard. Not one of the seasoned Air Force fighter pilots with thousands of hours in advanced tactical aircraft. Not one of the Marine aviators with multiple combat deployments and confirmed kills. The quiet woman in the back corner whose reputation had been carved from missions that never officially happened, whose call sign carried implications that most people in the room were only beginning to understand. Ghost felt the familiar calm that accompanied moments of absolute clarity, when all the complex variables of mission planning suddenly resolved into the simple geometry of tactical execution. She'd been here before, had carried similar responsibilities in operational environments where the stakes were equally high and the margin for error equally narrow. The difference was that those missions had been conducted in the shadows, with success measured by targets that simply vanished without explanation and objectives that were achieved without acknowledgement or recognition. Now, surrounded by peers who were still processing the implications of her selection as mission commander, she found herself in the unfamiliar position of being responsible not just for her own survival and mission success, but for leading a formation of exceptional pilots through an operational environment that would test every aspect of their training and capability. The tactical challenges were familiar: defended airspace, electronic warfare environments, marginal weather conditions, and terrain that left no room for navigation errors. But the strategic implications were unprecedented, extending far beyond the immediate mission objectives to encompass questions of American aviation superiority and the effectiveness of decades of advanced training and technology development. Around the room, she could sense the subtle recalibration occurring as professional aviators adjusted their perceptions to accommodate new information about the quiet pilot whose presence they'd barely registered, until she'd answered Hendricks' simple question about combat experience. Call signs like Ghost weren't earned flying routine training missions or standard operational deployments. They were forged in places where maps had blank spaces, and mission success was measured by the absence of evidence rather than the accumulation of battle damage assessments and confirmed kills. The tactical displays continued their rotation, showing satellite imagery that revealed the full scope of the challenges ahead. The target facility was protected by overlapping fields of fire from surface-to-air missile installations that represented the most advanced defensive technology available to hostile nations. Electronic warfare capabilities that could degrade or eliminate navigation and communication systems that American pilots had learned to depend on for mission success. Weather patterns that could transform marginal flying conditions into instrument-only challenges with minimal warning. The kind of operational environment where pilot skill would be measured in milliseconds and altitude changes, where the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure could come down to split-second decisions made under extreme stress with incomplete information. But Ghost had operated in similar environments, had navigated similar challenges in missions whose objectives had been achieved through methods that would never appear in official after-action reports or tactical manuals. The skills required for Operation Nightfall weren't just technical. They demanded the kind of tactical judgment that could only be developed through exposure to operational environments where standard procedures might not apply, and success depended on the ability to adapt and improvise under conditions where failure carried consequences that extended far beyond individual survival. Hendricks continued with the mission assignments, designating wingmen and support elements with the careful precision of someone who understood that success would depend not just on individual capability, but on the creation of teams that could function effectively under extreme stress. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez will fly as Ghost's wingman. Major Kim will lead the second element. Captain Thompson will coordinate electronic warfare support. Each assignment carried weight, represented careful calculation of personality profiles and operational experience that would either complement each other under stress or create friction that could compromise mission effectiveness. The briefing room had evolved from a place where information was shared to a crucible where legends were being forged, where the theoretical capabilities developed through years of advanced training were about to be tested against defensive systems designed specifically to counter American aviation superiority. The silence that had greeted Ghost's selection as mission commander was giving way to the focused attention of professionals who recognized that they were about to participate in something that would either validate their training or expose its limitations under the most demanding conditions modern warfare could produce. Ghost processed the mission parameters with the systematic thoroughness that had kept her alive through operations in places where survival depended on the ability to anticipate enemy responses and adapt to changing conditions faster than defensive systems could track and target individual aircraft. The facility shown in the satellite imagery represented more than just a tactical challenge. It was a statement of hostile intent, a fortress built by people who understood that their survival depended on making American aviation pay the highest possible price for every objective achieved and every target eliminated. The weather data scrolled across the tactical displays, showing cloud patterns and wind conditions that would add layers of complexity to an already challenging mission profile.